we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentation material at this point. And I do want to voice, I'm very happy that you're all here participating with us. If there is a time during this webinar series where some other part of your life needs to take priority on the second Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern, and you have to do something else, we will be recording these and we will post them on efficientvineyard.com under the webinar tab. So if you want to go back and listen again, or if you miss one and you want to catch up, they'll be available for you, obviously free there. Okay, so let's get started, everybody. So for today's webinar, we're first going to introduce ourselves because a lot of you don't know us yet. So we're going to give you a little background on your presenters today, and then we're going to talk about why we're here and what we're intending to do with this webinar series, and then just a little bit about the format of how the webinars are going to work. We're going to define precision viticulture. Very important to know, what are we talking about here? And that's the bulk of this talk is going to be really clearly drawing boundaries around precision viticulture and what we're talking about. And we'll follow that with a little history. A lot of the technology we're applying to viticulture began with broadacre crops. So we're going to take through a little timeline of kind of how that transition came about. Then we're going to talk about the Efficient Vineyard project, which brought us to you today. And then we're going to address some key themes and topics because I know that you all want to know what we're going to talk about as the webinar series moves forward. And again, if you'd like to contribute to that and kind of structuring that discussion, please feel free to give us feedback and we will do our best to address what you all want to know because we're here to serve you.
My name's Kevin Martin. Jackie was kind enough to introduce me already. I want to thank her for being our host. If you want to think of me as a jack of a few trades and maybe not really a master of too many, I was, in my educational background is a liberal arts education. So I get to do a little bit of a lot of different things with the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program. I've been here for 9 years and I dabble in policy and economics and business management for our grape growers. So I bring that to the project in terms of trying to make the tools that we create and that we experiment with something that is available to a wide audience of growers and is something that does have commercial application to as many growers as we can reach. So happy to be with you today.
All right, so my name's Jackie Dresser, as some of you may have heard already. I've been drawing maps for a long time. I started a surveying apprenticeship when I was 15, so it's sort of in my blood. My dad's a surveyor, and measuring things and thinking about the relationships of them spatially or in space it's sort of ingrained in how I think and how I operate. So being able to bring that to agriculture and viticulture specifically has been really great. So the LSIT certification that you're seeing there is sort of an interim to a professional land surveying degree. So basically saying I sat in a testing facility for 8 hours and it's sort of like the bar for surveying. I've had 4 commercial growing seasons with a small production in New York State, upstate New York. Did a little bit of the urban winery thing down in Brooklyn too, so that was fun. And I've joined the Efficient Vineyard project in 2016, and I've worked with a little bit of everything, focusing on the data we get from our sensors, doing commercial field scale research trials, and also trying to do my best to bring the information to our base and now to you. And my research focus is really on spatial crop load management. So we'll talk about what that means, but basically balancing the size of a crop with the size of the vine that's attempting to ripen it. So that's where I'm coming from. So as I mentioned in our kind of open discussion section, we realized that the world of precision viticulture, especially on the academic side, is so vast. There's so much information coming at you. And as our first question alluded to, a lot of the technology isn't really tailored to viticulture. So what we're trying to do with this webinar series is to kind of take this wide world of information, distill it down into something you can use, filter out the fluff, and give you the meat of really what you can apply in your operation. Or if you're not a grower and you just want to learn more, to give you just a really plain English version of what's out there in the academic and commercial world of viticulture. So We're going to start at 1 p.m. Eastern, the second Tuesday of every month. So mark it on your calendar and plan to be here with us. And we are going to take about 30 to 45 minutes of structured presentation, depending on how many people come. If we do have a more intimate crowd, we might be able to kind of open the verbal space for everybody to share in the beginning as people are signing on and kind of get to know each other a little bit more that way. And following our formal structured presentation, we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A, which you can interact with us either in text or by raising your hand. Okay, so kind of a little surveying 101 here, which it's really important to understand. It's called precision viticulture. There's a real difference between precision and with accuracy. So the first bullseye you're seeing on your left, that's a tight cluster there. That's precise. So you can have precision not without necessarily being accurate. And you can also have accuracy without necessarily being precise. So the second bullseye, it's accurate. Your measurements are very close to their true value, but they're not necessarily repeated very tight to each other. Then you can be precise and accurate. You're repeating your measurements very precisely, and you're also hitting your target. And you can be neither precise nor accurate. So in this world of precision viticulture, you're going to come across a lot of sensors. They may be really precise, but are they measuring what you want to know? Can you trust the values that are coming from them? Can you trust the maps you're getting? Do you know how the data was processed? Those type of things. That's really the crux of what we're getting at. So this is a really important base to understand as you begin learning about precision viticulture. Precision does not mean that you hit what you intend to hit. It just means you can repeat it, basically. You can repeat your measurements. So accuracy is how close the measurements come to the true value, not how close they are to each other, which is also important. And we're going to take a whole webinar to talk about just global positioning using satellites, which is a real crux of our research here. So in precision viticulture, precision and accuracy are both important. All right, so we're going to dedicate a lot of time to this, defining precision viticulture. So here's one definition just pulled out of the literature. I know you all can read, but some of us are verbal learners like me. So it's a suite of technologies that provides grape growers and winemakers with the means to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach to vineyard management. Now, I think this falls down in focusing on the suite of technologies. So it's not just the technologies, it's the processes and the systems that connect them to each other. So not totally sold on this as a definition for precision viticulture. So another one, a differentiated management approach aiming to meet the real needs of each parcel within the vineyard. And I think this one sort of alludes to blocking or a parcel within the vineyard. So we're not just concerned with vineyard blocks, we're concerned with whole farms. We're concerned with sub-vineyard level. So it's really not just targeting a parcel, it's targeting within a parcel and the whole operation itself. So we'll keep moving through here. So the application of precision agriculture techniques to viticulture. And the reason I'm not totally sold on this definition is that it's not just the application of the techniques, because they really all need to be modified. Viticulture and perennial systems in general are much different than broadacre crops. And this is one of the major challenges for beginning precision viticulturists or experienced ones, is being able to take something tailored to a different technique to viticulture. Good question. In the chat box, I just heard, is there a difference between precision viticulture and variable rate farming? Awesome question. We're definitely going to get to that. So just stay tuned and hopefully you can answer that yourself by the end of the talk here. All right, so then monitoring and managing spatial variations in productivity-related variables within single vineyard blocks. Again, within single vineyard blocks, I think this sort of falls down, and we want to apply this on a commercial scale. If you're farming 8 acres, if you're farming 4,000, we want to be able to efficiently look at that spatial variation and apply a tailored approach across a whole farm, not just within one block. So really, basically, vineyards vary. We know that. You know that. If you farm, you understand that. But how can we use that variation to our advantage as stewards of these vineyards. So rather than fighting that variation, how can we use it? So if you're a winery and maybe you don't want to have a uniform vineyard, but maybe you want to do a differential harvest and tailor your lower quality fruit to a different label than your high quality fruit. That's something that falls underneath the umbrella of precision viticulture. Maybe you're a bulk producer and you really want to hit a consistent yield across your vineyard year in and year out and know exactly that you're able to ripen the whole thing and pick it all on the same day. So if you have different objectives, precision viticulture should serve to address those for anybody. So what do we mean by vary? What do we mean by that? Oh, sorry, let me back up here. Gotta highlight my play button. So we're looking at the United States, as you all can clearly see. So let's just take a little bit of a look at a vineyard. So we're gonna zoom into where we're coming to you from, the Lake Erie region, and you can look at a vineyard like this. It's a piece of land that we're gonna farm. Here's the boundaries, here's the parcels or the blocks, but maybe it varies, and here's an NRCS soil data layer that's showing you the variation in soil. But can we measure that? Can we give you a higher resolution image of what's really happening? And maybe that varies with depth. Maybe we see that those patterns are slightly different a little bit deeper down. And then those patterns, they might be driving growth, they might be driving yield. So those areas that are in a certain soil type might appear red, they might be restricted in vine size. And maybe we can take all that information, we can layer it together along with the grower's knowledge of the vineyard and come up with a management approach that's different in the green and different in the pink and different in the blue. And in doing that, we can make the vineyard work for us. We can make it a little bit more efficient. Okay, so knowing this, let's propose a little bit of a new definition. First of all, precision viticulture is a cyclical management system. And cyclical means that it repeats itself. So we're collecting information, we're validating that in the vineyard, using off-the-shelf sensors, using our own 2 eyes, using an old-fashioned scale. We're processing, layering, and interpreting that data, and maybe visualizing it in the form of a map. Using that data, we're gonna make a decision, right? We're gonna do something with it. And that's where the variable rate technology comes in. Maybe we're gonna use variable rate technology to implement the decision we use with that precision viticulture data. Then we're going to evaluate, how do we do? Did we like our decision? Did we get the results that we want? Or maybe we're gonna have to regroup and come back next year and start the whole thing over again. Measure, manage, evaluate. Okay, so a cyclical management system that uses high resolution. What do we mean by high resolution? So if you're dealing with a viticulture measurement that's a little bit cumbersome to collect, like maybe pruning weight. You know, you have to sit there and weigh the prunings of every single vine you prune. You're probably not gonna do that in the sampling scheme on the right. You're probably gonna do it with the sampling scheme on the left. So we need to find a way to find an efficient and quick means of getting the data we need at the resolution that's on the right. So very dense data points that cover the entire area of the vineyard. Okay, so that's important, high resolution. So georeference measurements. What do we mean by georeferenced? Well, we mean we know where we are in space, and we can use satellites to help us find our location, so commonly known as GPS, and we're gonna do a whole webinar on that. Or we can walk out to a vine and say, you know, we're at row 47, vine 8, and we took measurement B. So we know where we are in space. So that's very important in the world of precision viticulture. So of vineyard attributes, well, what's important to you? You know, it depends on really what you're managing. Maybe you want to know what's going on in the soil, what soil type you're working with. Maybe you want a leaf area measurement. Maybe you want to know about bricks or how ripe the fruit is. Maybe you want to know your yield. So all of these vineyard attributes, we're going to want to find a way to measure them at that high resolution that we spoke about earlier. Okay, so why are we doing this? Why are we taking all these measurements? Well, we want to spatially define heterogeneity. So spatially, in space, across space, define heterogeneity. So that's what we're talking about with vineyards vary. Maybe they vary in soil type. Maybe they vary in the size of the vines themselves. Maybe they vary in the yields that come off of those vines. So we're going to find ways to define that spatially. So across the whole vineyard, we want to know what patterns are appearing so that we know what to do with them. And this might be something, I do hear this a lot from growers. You know, I'm running these rows. I know where the small regions are. I know where the strong parts of the vineyard are. What this technology allows and this system allows is for that to be in front of you in a map form. You get a bird's eye view of the whole vineyard. You know how big the area is that's struggling. You know not just what your average tons per acre are across a vineyard. You know in space, each, you know, maybe even each vine or each section of vineyard, how much they're each producing. So we're spatially defining that variation. And adapting vineyard management practices. So maybe you're putting lime down, and keep a close eye on this chain here and its speed. You'll see it speed up there. So why is it doing that? Well, because we gave it a map to follow, and it's giving the soil, which, you know, I know none of us have X-ray vision, it's giving it what it needs in space. So we're adapting our vineyard management practices, and it doesn't just have to be spreading lime. It can be all sorts of management, but we're adapting it based on the information that we've collected. Oops, apologies there. All right, and we want to appropriately we are adapting vineyard management practices appropriately. Keyword, we want to make a really good decision about what we're doing, where we're implementing that. And that's where a lot of you as growers or as extension educators or as viticulturists really come in. The human brain is a really important piece of this puzzle. So you have to know your vineyard and use the information, hopefully good information, to make a good management decision. And we're trying to optimize whole vineyard performance. So in this vineyard, as you can see, I mean, our profit per acre is ranging from -600 in the red all the way up to making 500 in the blue. And this is for bulk juice grapes. And so as a grower, you want to make sure not only are you making money, but you're making money across the whole vineyard. So we want to optimize that whole vineyard's performance. So in a nutshell, we're talking about a cyclical management system. So this video is going to show you the whole cycle using georeference measurements of vineyard attributes to spatially define heterogeneity and adapt vineyard management practices appropriately to optimize whole vineyard performance. So maybe that's pruning. Maybe it's where you're planting cover crop or what seed mix you're using. Maybe it's shoot thinning and the level of shoot thinning or fruit thinning that you're using in the vineyard. We're adapting it to what that area of the vineyard needs, and then we're evaluating it. We're following behind and we're taking a look. We're sharing the information that we learn. Are we doing a good job? Do we like what we did? Do we need to tweak it for the next season? All right, so how did we get here? Now that we know what we're talking about and what precision viticulture is, how did we get here? So precision agriculture, as a more broad term that precision viticulture falls within, really started with grid sampling in the soil for variable rate fertilization in row crops. And this was early 80s. This is not necessarily a new technology. So if you remember on the resolution slide, that grid sampling, the tighter your grid, the more resolution you're going to get, and the more confident you are that the map you make from that data is giving you the real picture of what's going on. So grid sampling, it's manual. You got to take a lot of samples. So not only do you have your time going out there to take those samples, but all the cost of processing those samples and getting your soil analysis back. So that's where we started. And then what really made it take off, I think, is when Navstar GPS, which is the United States constellation of satellites, opened up for civilian use. And it was limited. The accuracy wasn't great back then. It was for the military, but they were afraid that by opening it up to civilians, they would be kind of compromising national security. So it wasn't tremendous accuracy, but it did allow you, rather than having to write down the row number each time, it allowed you to take an antenna that could capture data from satellites and pinpoint your position on the earth. And as we all know, we're at a point where we have self-driving cars now that operate on that same technology. So pretty important turning point there. Then in the 80s, geostatistics and GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems. So that Google Maps on your phone, that's a GIS. And there are more sophisticated versions of that we use for precision viticulture. So this was the first time that a geostatistics, so specific ways to deal with the data coming from these sensors, was developed, ways to process them, ways to layer them, ways to find patterns in huge files with, tons of data points there. Then variable rate electronic controllers were developed, and they were integrated with GPS signals. So just like you saw in that brief clip of variable rate lime spreading, knowing the machine would know where it was in space and it would know what to do there. And then the first crop yield monitoring systems, I believe they were for wheat, but they were for broadacre crops, and they came onto the market just cusping onto the 90s there. And then really research started hitting the floor, beginning in Australia with folks like Rob Bramley and colleagues. So they began research on adapting precision ag techniques to viticulture and seeing if this would work for us, basically. And the first workshop on precision agriculture broadly, and this was before the term was even very clearly defined, but it was held at the University of Minnesota in '93. And then the first international conference on precision agriculture was held in '97, following the US Congress defining precision ag on the books and starting an act that would fund research in this sphere. So that was kind of the first definition of precision ag. And then the grape yield monitor started to be commercialized, and research began in the AU and the US. And yield monitoring went from just for broadacre crops to grape yield monitor. And that's still something we're trying to tackle to this day, is getting a really good grape yield monitor for grapes. Then auto steering for tractors begins. So that really helped and translates. A lot of this was taken up very quickly in broadacre, where swath control and overlap is very important, and kind of less quickly in viticulture scenarios. This was another key turning point, especially from a surveying point of view, where we're looking for sub-centimeter accuracy with GPS. So the civilian scramble was removed in the year 2000. President Bill Clinton signed a bill and said, we need to open this up, an accurate signal to everybody for free. So that's kind of when everything in the world of global positioning really exploded. And it became really a viable means of locating yourself pretty accurately in space. Following that, reflectance sensors and vegetative indices. If you have no idea what this means, just keep your seatbelt on. We're going to get into all of that in part of this webinar. So they're used to map variability in vine growth. That was kind of the first time for vines. Again, these reflectance sensors did originate in precision agriculture, so adapting them to a viticulture scenario does have its own challenges that we're still facing. And then soil electrical conductivity sensors were used to map variation in soil in vineyards. So in the little Google Earth flyover that we did, those data layers came from a soil sensor that we use. And we'll talk about that. That's a whole webinar in itself as well. And then here, variable rate technology was integrated with VMEC equipment. So many of you have heard of Oxbow. Midwest Grower Supply currently offers the VMEC line, which kicked off with Dr. Justin Morris's research with the Morris-Aldridge complete system for vineyard mechanization. So sort of a legend, and we're carrying all of the work that he did into the future, really, by integrating the variable rate piece to the mechanization systems that he worked on. And now we're kind of in a robotics sphere. Like I mentioned, the self-driving cars. So there's a lot of this type of interest for viticulture scenarios, and part of our project is dedicated to some of those technologies as well. So this brings us into kind of another timeline, which is the personal timeline of efficient vineyard. And we really began playing around with this stuff in 2009, when we were first using proximal spectral reflectance sensors and yield monitors in Concord vineyards. And then we said, all right, well, let's validate the signal that's coming from these. You know, they're intending to map variation in vine growth. So we took the manual measurement that is typically the benchmark for that, which is pruning weight, and tried to see if that correlated well to the readings that we were getting from the sensors. And as you can see in our little graph there, we did see a really good relationship there between pruning weight and the signal we were getting from our sensors there. And then integrating the information from the yield monitor and the information from the sensors and the pruning weight measurements into a crop load. So the balance, again, of the size of the vine with the fruit that it's intending to ripen. All right, and then we kind of linked up with some colleagues at CMU, and they started to see, okay, so there's these NDVI sensors, or there's these spectral reflection sensors. What other sensors are out there in this sphere that we can use to get valuable information in the vineyard? So we're going to dedicate a lot of the webinar series to the technologies that they've developed as well. And then NGWI, which has now changed to NGRA, I believe, they funded a pilot study for us to kind of see what we could learn about starting to layer these different sources of data we were collecting, and what ways we can make that data the most useful for vineyard managers. And then more into the layering. So how can we take different sensors, the data that we get from them, and come up with really good management classifications or management zones in the vineyard? How can we use the data to implement best management practices in the vineyard? And what algorithms need to happen behind the scenes that a grower may never see, but that are very important to making sure that the sensors are operating properly, they're getting a map that makes sense to what they see in the vineyard, and the management that they're imposing is giving them the desired effect. All right, and we're moving on to more spatial data collection, processing, and validation. And this step was really trying to implement this out of a research setting and in commercial vineyards. So in California and in upstate New York, we were taking a look at full commercial size blocks here. And then we got to the status where we are now, which is the Efficient Vineyard Project began. So the USDA NIFA Specialty Crop Research Initiative funded a project that we're in right now, and that brings us to you, called Precision Vineyard Management, Collecting and Interpreting Spatial Data for Variable Vineyard Management. So what we're trying to do broadly with this project is find sensors that work in vineyards. If they don't exist, develop them to measure soil, canopy, and crop characteristics. So what's going on in the soil that influences growth? How is that growth exhibiting in space? What kind of yields are we pulling off, and how can we manipulate those things to give us our desired outcome in the vineyard? All right, so essentially, we have three major fearless leaders on this project. One of them is Dr. Terry Bates. He's in the top picture there. He's based here at the Cornell Lake Erie Research and Extension Laboratory, and he's the PI on the major project. So he's kind of like the overall fearless leader. And he's kind of involved not only with keeping everybody else in sync with each other and making sure we're meeting project objectives, but also doing a lot of the in the vineyard research. And he was in it from the days of walking around with a NDVI sensor by hand and taking individual measurements. So he's been in it a long time. And below him, you see George Cantor, and he's with Carnegie Mellon University. He's heading up the project team that's developing the imager that you see there, the red camera system there for imaging. And that's going to be a couple podcasts on its own, also dealing with some robotics engineering that's tailored to viticulture as well. And below him, you see Dr. James Taylor, and he's the brains behind all the spatial data processing. And he comes from the larger world of precision agriculture. So it's great to have someone that's experienced with funneling things that are developed for precision ag and making it tailored to precision viticulture. So we talked a little bit about crop load management. So crop load, the relationship between yield and the size of a vine. So how can we measure those things spatially? How can we manipulate them to make sure that that relationship is balanced? And then kind of what's going on in the soil that might be trying to sabotage us and buffer the management decisions that we're making in the field. And here is a model that Dr. Terry Bates developed for Concord production. So you can see it's sort of broken into different sizes of vines, and the crop load that they're able to, the yield that they're able to handle and ripen in a good, exceptional year, you know, warm, dry, extended year, and then in a normal year. And for us, abbreviated growing seasons are sort of the norm. You know, we get the 4 seasons out here for sure. So we know that hanging too much fruit on a small vine is bad. We know that hanging too little fruit on a large vine is also bad. So part of our project is determining how to influence those things to optimize your profitability and economic viability of all your vineyard enterprises. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kevin, who's going to talk a little bit more about the economics.
So my role in the project, I've had a couple of different roles. One of the things we want to do, you saw a lot of pictures of different sensors and applications. We want to put together budgets for sensor packages based on their end use. So we do have a lot of those things. For example, probably the benchmark sensor that we rely most on, and especially in the East Coast, is the NDVI sensor and the equipment that goes along with that to commercialize that sensor in vineyards. We also have experience with variable rate tractor technology. Some of the videos you saw were variable rate tools that are already commercialized in a few of our vineyards. So we know what those things cost, and we can help growers sort of work through those budgets based on their size and scale and what they're actually going to be using that equipment for. A lot of this stuff can be applied for different production practices. So how broadly they expect to apply variable rate tractor technology is important in terms of coming up with a realistic cost basis and making sure that this technology is not just a really cool toy, but a way for these growers to be more profitable. Dual EM and other ways to measure soil are also things we've looked at in terms of cost and what that adds to the bottom line. The stereo camera sensor developed by Carnegie Mellon is something we're sort of monitoring. It's not something you can go out and buy today, but there's an understanding that commercialization is going to be cost dependent, and if it costs $75,000, what types of growers will buy it versus it costing something like $20,000. So we're trying to understand that cost and what the applications of those sensors will be based on how it's driven in terms of costs. We try to remain pretty much audience neutral. We are located in an area that's commodity driven. 90 to 95% of our acreage is basically bulk juice or wine production, but we do have an understanding of other markets, and they're sort of the emerging small wineries is an important market for our region. So we do see applications in other types of markets, and we would like to service those markets. So you don't have to be a 2,000 acre grower to really benefit from precision viticulture. The application might be a little bit different. You might not be spending $25,000 on a variable rate lime spreader, but particularly in assisting with decision making, it can help much smaller growers in a more realistic way. That being said, some of our primary work has been with some larger growers. Looking at one of the most important production practices in our region is managing vine size and crop load. So one of the things our growers like to do is maximize their yield. And in doing so, their crop load tends to get out of balance, sometimes in a way that's opposite of most of the smaller wine industry. So we're overcropped. Our vines are too small and our yield is too large. One of the ways we can manage that is through crop thinning in July for us, so 30 days post bloom. This is what some of those results look like in commercial vineyards on individual blocks. We see return crops that increase by 50% or by 20% or 10% or nothing, and we also see return crops decline by as much as 60%. Essentially, our larger growers are overwhelmed with the amount of data and calibration they have to do, and there's a tendency to underthin and overthin because of a lack of data management. And we think this is where precision viticulture can help. So we tried it in a commercial vineyard. We didn't thin very much. The grower didn't really want to thin. So in comparing the economic valuation of this trial, we compared it to unthinned blocks. It was a situation where I think we would all agree a commercial grower in our area would not have thinned in this situation. It was very lightly thinned. And in the previous graph, you saw where in a commercial vineyard, a 40% increase in return crop was beneficial. So if you took off 1 ton and you got an extra 1.4 tons in the following year, you were happy with that. This doubled the return crop. So for every ton you took off, you increased your yield by 2 tons the following year. It decreased the year-to-year variability. It probably decreased spatial variation. We're going to continue to verify that as we see if these patterns evolve over time. But initial data does look like spatial variability was decreased, at least temporarily, by this management trial. It's possible that the unique weather patterns and drought stress exaggerated the economic impact, but we do know it worked to an extent that certainly surprised me, with a theoretical payback for a 180-acre farmer, which is what this farmer would be. If they had done this across more of their acreage, 1 year was a realistic payback period. So we don't necessarily expect results to always be that great, but it certainly does show that the technology is promising, and even if it involves a significant investment, can pay for itself. I think we have some time for questions, but do you want to go over?
We did have a question on which color was the one that we thinned in this research trial. Do you remember? The dark blue or the medium blue?
I think this was actually a map of how much we thinned, and I don't think we thinned where in the red, I believe.
Got it. Okay, so the red in this map are representing the control that we left so we could sample what would happen if we did nothing. And this map would represent a prescription map, sort of like the one that you saw in the variable rate clip. So in the field computer and the tractor, this is the map that shows up. And each of those colors is embedded with a prescription or a set of digital instructions that tells the hydraulic flow rate controller how much hydraulic fluid to let through to the motor that's controlling the bow rods and the harvester and the rate that they're moving. So in this case, you're thinning everything, but you're varying the rate of your thinning by which color that you're in. So I hope that answers your question. If not, just pop on and ask something more specific. And variable rate fruit thinning as a specific trial is something, we'll have a whole webinar just on that. So if you have more questions, I mean, this webinar is really kind of just to draw the boundaries about what we're talking about and get your feet wet. And we're going to dive into some more topics. And I know you're all curious, so we'll just give you a little sneak peek of what we'll be up to as the webinar moves forward. So one basic theme we're going to talk about is spatial measurements. So whether those are by hand, whether those are from sensors, and then how we validate those in the vineyard. We're going to talk a lot about GNSS, which is Global Navigation Satellite System. I think it's really important, even for entry-level consumers. You don't have to be an expert in how GPS works, but I think there's a lot of people that are trying to sell things, and they're going to tell you what you need to know to spend more money on products. So if you have a baseline knowledge of how global positioning works and kind of what hardware is out there and what you need for your applications, I think you're going to just be a much better informed consumer. So we're going to deal with that a little bit. And I'm a surveyor, so I want to nerd out, so hope you're willing to listen. Soil is another thing we're going to talk about. So we'll do some, for this type of thing, we'll do some basic viticulture, and then we'll kind of layer that on top of how do we apply this viticulture spatially. So for soil, you know, we'll touch on some basics, and then we'll talk about how soil EC sensors work and what they're able to measure, what their limitations are, and then what you can do as an owner, a viticulturist, researcher, to translate those maps into something you can really use spatially. And then same thing, canopy yield, fruit quality, some new sensors in development to get a spatial quality map. So we all want to know how ripe our fruit is, or different quality parameters if you're in wine production. So how can we look at those spatially across the vineyard as well? Another big piece, we don't ever really expect you all to be experts on what to do with the data, but I think it's good to know that, especially as a lot of these sort of startups appear in the sphere, that not all data processing is created equal, and the analysis really matters, and how you visualize that data, it really matters. So we're going to just talk about the body of research that's led to the protocols that we follow and why they're important. So you, again, just can be an educated consumer out there in the world, even if you're hiring out that service. Then we're going to talk about how we can implement this. So what sort of variable rate technology can we use to vary our fertilizer applications, to maybe vary our irrigation, to vary our crop management through something like shoot thinning. Yield estimation, really important. This has been sort of personally a big research focus as part of this project. We want to know how it's possible every year to get within 5% of our final yield, and to do that as early as possible. So if we know we're hanging a huge crop, we have time to do something about it, and see a positive effect of that in a season. So we have a lot of different technology we're using and protocols we're developing to get a good crop estimate, and that'll be a webinar in itself as well. So stay tuned for that. And then again, like if you know you're hanging a big crop, how can you balance the amount of fruit on the vine through a practice like variable rate fruit thinning? So please get a hold of us. We have a website. It has a contact us form, so you can always go to efficientvineyard.com or Google Efficient Vineyard, and you'll end up there, and contact us through the form on the website. You can email me directly. Kevin didn't have a choice of whether you're going to email him directly because I just put this up here. So send him an email or give us a call at the lab. And if you're on the phone, I'll read these so you have time to write them down if you're just calling in. So my email address is jd929@cornell.edu. I can be reached by phone. This goes for Kevin as well at 716-792-2800. And you can email Kevin at kmm52@psu.edu. All right, so yeah, with that, we're going to open to the Q&A, and I'm just going to play this little montage here behind it, so you can just get, oh, it stopped it, so let's use their computer here. Here we go, okay. Okay, so first question we have is, how is the harvest forecasting and color development of grape cluster research coming along? Any commercial solutions available yet? I'll start with the latter part. No commercial solutions. We're still working with prototypes at this point, but a big research focus for us is, you know, what's this good for if people can't use it? So we really want to spend a lot of time focusing on what capabilities of that particular machine, which is an imaging solution. Right now, we're kind of testing more with a broad stroke. What are all the things that this can do? And trying to latch on to a couple of those that really seem like the most feasible for commercialization. So that's going to be a whole webinar by itself, probably multiple webinars about what the research that Carnegie Mellon is doing is focused on, and kind of what applications are coming down the pike for that. So definitely stay tuned for that in the webinar series. We're going to dedicate a lot of time to that. Any companies offering PV services in New England? I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I'm not really sure specifically what consulting companies are in your area. So Paul, if you could send me a direct email, and I'll get back to you personally and see if I can hook you up with anybody. I do know in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York and Western New York, there are a couple companies that offer mapping of vineyards with a soil sensor that's a little different than the one that we use, and then they'll come out and do your soil sampling and give you variable rate fertilization recommends. So I do know that that's available, but I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for. So just reach out and I'll see if I can connect you to somebody that can help you. Maybe even we can. All right, Tim Martinson, question. These sensors generate a lot of data, indeed. What do you envision the endpoint for data handling and interface that will make it manageable for growers? So it sort of varies by sensor here. The sensors that we use that are currently off the shelf are really small data files, actually. I mean, they're just kilobytes. Even if you do, I mean, I've done 80 acres and not even taken up a gig. So the data files themselves aren't really that large, so I don't see it really being a problem from a data storage standpoint. I think the data processing and visualization part, so taking the raw data, processing that, generating a map, and then counseling a grower on how to use that the most effectively. This could be something, and I know we have some extension specialists on board here with the webinar, so this could be something that is addressed through an extension sphere. It could be something that is addressed in the private consulting world. And also as part of the project, Dr. James Taylor is heading up the research team that is developing open source software. So open source meaning free and available for anyone to use, to take data out of a sensor, process it, and give you a map. I still think, and hopefully by the end of the webinar, series that people that attend are a little bit more well equipped in this area. You know, just trusting blindly what comes out of a sensor, even if it's processed right, you know, it might not be the best path forward. So really the more savvy you can be with what this data should look like, what values are sensible, and how to use the data to direct you to places in the vineyard to validate and look and see if this data really makes sense. And then in terms of coming up with a management strategy on the data, being on the ground, I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be a substitute for boots on the ground and really evaluating what's going on in the vineyard and if that correlates well to the signal you're getting from a sensor. And then again, we talked about the cyclical nature of precision viticulture, being able to evaluate the decision that you made and see if it worked, which is really important as well, because how do you know? I mean, if you spend a lot of time crop thinning, but you don't know what your final yield is, or your yield monitor breaks down, or you know, you don't have your truck weight, stuff like that. So making sure that you kind of follow the data stream all the way through a growing season. Yeah, but that's our intention. We want to be here to help growers and help them get involved. So thanks for your question. From Lucy Morton, when do you make your crop estimates? How does rainfall near harvest change your crop estimates? That is a fantastic question. Again, we're going to spend a whole webinar series, or sorry, a whole webinar session on just this topic. Where we're coming from in Lake Erie, our bulk juice production is pretty much centered on one grape variety. So that is a big asset for us. And we've spent, I say we, but this is far beyond before me. We've spent the past couple decades taking intensive berry weight collections from fruit set all the way through harvest, whenever that happens to be, and generating models for that information and using that as a tool to be able to convert our yield estimate mid-season into a final estimate. And we have a predictive model that actually integrates rainfall that we've used here in our region, but there certainly needs to be an effort research-wise to characterize some other major grape varieties, and we're working with colleagues in the Finger Lakes to do that, and we're also planning some new varieties here on our research farm to do that on the East Coast. But I think a good surrogate for that is to just be really sure what your historical yield or final berry weight is, to keep that information. And then when you do your crop estimate, whatever time that is, we like 30 days after bloom here. Without getting too specific, the challenge at that time period is that berry weight is increasing really rapidly. So you're catching, you're catching something on a pretty steep slope. So your error one side or the other is pretty high. But the reason we like to do it at 30 days post bloom is that we've done enough research to know that most of the time we're at 50% of our final berry weight at 30 days post bloom. So it's very easy for a grower to take a sample and multiply by 2. It's pretty easy. So that kind of gets rid of the in-season fluctuation and is sort of a good benchmark. But we're constantly refining this protocol and working on how to integrate spatial data and getting us even closer to a yield estimate. And if you happen to be going to ACEV National in Monterey next week, I'll be there talking about crop estimation. So if you're interested, come and track me down. Okay, Yun Zhang says, any information on using NDVI maps to guide irrigation management, i.e. getting crop coefficients from NDVI maps? So I think the best way to answer this question is that this is a big piece for the validation. So we'll get into this again. So if this is over a lot of your head, please don't worry about it. We're going to really break this down in future webinars. But an NDVI is a ratio. So it's between 0 and 1, and it's a relative indication of what's going out in the vineyard. And until you get out there and see, either take a leaf area measurement or 10, or take a pruning weight measurement or a few, or just get out there and look, you're not really going to know absolutely what's going on. You're going to have the relative patterns, which can be really useful. So if you know that your elevation might be different, and the vines at the bottom of the hill have wet feet and the vines at the top of the hill tend to be too dry, you can use that and use your knowledge of the vineyard to change the prescription with how you're irrigating those two sections of the vineyard, and kind of vice versa in the middle. So specifically in the research world, irrigation, we haven't run a formal trial on irrigation on the East Coast. There's been a little bit of research on the West Coast that we don't have final results to share yet, but when we do, you'll be the first to know. Okay, I think that's it for questions. And anyone can also feel free to raise their hand if they'd like to offer any questions or comments to the dialogue. Okay, and with that, we will just thank you all so much for your time and encourage you to reach out to us either via email or our website, and we will send you all an email with our next topic for next month's webinar and registration. You will have to register for each one, so we'll ask you to do that again. Oh, I've been corrected. You don't have to register, so you're on the list whether you like it or not. All right, thank you everyone for your time and wishing you a happy and healthy growing season.